Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shab. I hope everything is well. You can start when you're ready, sir.
Thanks, Todd. Could you just let me know if the screen is being shared?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear participants. Welcome to this session of our Islam Study Circle. As is our routine, we'll still start off with a Quranic verse and then followed by a Hadith and then verses from the Bible before we move on to the next session. As far as the Quranic verse is concerned, the one that I've chosen for you, which is being displayed before you on the screen, relates to a very, very important area of our life, and that is the rule of law that has to be honored in all circumstances. And before we speak more about it, let me just read out the Quranic verse and also a translation of that verse. So the verse reads, يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم فإن تنازعتم في شيء فردوه إلى الله والرسول إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر ذلك خير وأحسن تأويلا. Which means, believers, obey God and obey the messenger and those of you who are in authority. However, if you disagree among yourselves in any matter, refer it to God and the messenger if you believe in God in the last day. This is better and more seemly as regards the consequences. So, as you can see, the important area or the important part of this verse is the one which is actually which occurs in the very first clause, and the clause that I'm actually referring to is "Atiur Raha wa Atiur Rasul wa ulil amri minkum," which means that you have to obey God and the messenger and those of you who are in authority. So, as far as the uh, obeying to God and His messenger is concerned, this is, of course, something which is very, just a moment, which is very commonly mentioned in the Quran. However, what is of very importance, extreme importance and significance, is the next clause, which says that you have to obey those in authority. Now, this actually means that you have to obey the law of the land, the area in which you are living, the country in which you are living. You have to live in that country as its obedient citizens. You cannot at all disobey the law. You have to be respectful to the law. And when we say you have to be respectful to the law, it begins with very small things, like, for example, not using your cell phone while driving, observing the speed limits, observing all sorts of traffic laws, and at the same time, also observing other laws of the country, which includes not littering on the streets or on the roads, and being citizens who look after the interests of their country and do not disobey the law. And even when they think that they have to do something which their own religion tells us to do, and it might clash with the law of the land, in that case also, all the stipulation is that if doing something which, or you're following something which in your own interpretation is actually different from the law of the land, then in that matter, although you are not required to obey the law, but then in the similar case, you have to explain your point of view to the authorities and tell them that if you're not obeying the law because of a certain reason, and that reason is that you think that law clashes with your own interpretation of your religion, then that should be a matter of debate between you and the authorities. And ultimately, if you still persist with your own point of view, then you might have to face the law or persecution even from the state authorities. But the inclination or the proclivity of disobeying the law cannot be entertained in any way. And this disobeying of law, we can see this being practiced so commonly that one really feels very ashamed. And whilst living in non-Muslim countries in particular as minorities, Muslims do have this habit of making their own selves in a spot of bother by actually thinking that they can hoodwink the law, they can befool the law, Of course, as far as some of the stipulations of religion are concerned, even though that is not allowed, but of course it can be understandable. But what about lying or perjury? Like, for example, lying on oaths that you're going to bring your partner, or you're going to falsely claim that you're married simply that you want to obtain a visa, and then you sign a false declaration and you come to countries like the United States or the UK or Australia or other countries, simply lying on oaths. And then again, what you do is that you divorce the lady who in connivance with you actually had made this whole settlement. And other areas as well, they need our very strong attention. For example, there is this law in the United States and many Commonwealth countries that you cannot marry more than once. So monogamy is only encouraged. You cannot indulge in polygamy or polyandry. So what Muslims do when they reach these Western countries is that they do not declare a second or a third marriage. They do it in their own way between one another through their own nikah muftis, but they do not declare to the state, and they think that this is something which, since their own religion has allowed, so therefore if they start to obey it, it would not be, it would not contravene the law of the land. Of course, they don't realize the fact that in this case, they are lying and they are hiding something which they have no business to do, which they have no authority to do. If it is an offense in a Western country to not marry again, then we have to understand that marrying though more than once is never or was never an obligation of Islam. And hence we are not violating any directive of Islam. It was never a violation, it never an obligation, it was an option, and that too in certain situations. So merely to marry, you hoodwink the law and misstate that you have just married once. You do not register your marriage, your second or third marriage, with the state authorities. This is an absolutely uncalled for, and it is a heinous crime in the eyes of the law. Another example that comes to my mind in which we people living in Western countries very openly violate the law is our cousin marriages. We know there are states in the United States which do not allow cousin marriages, but we actually do not at times disclose that we are marrying a cousin, and again we are guilty of hoodwinking the law. So it has to be understood that we have to obey the law come what may. The writ of the law of the land has tremendous authority. In other words, if I can say that obeying the law of the land is like obeying the Sharia of God, then that would be exactly a precise statement. Because when the Quran says ulul amri minkum, it actually asks us that we have to obey the law of the land. As law-abiding citizens, we just cannot break the law. We have to abide by the law. And when we stop by a red light at night, it's not just that we have been ordained by our citizenship laws that we have to stop at the red light. We must realize that it is our religion which stops us as well, because it says that you have to obey the law of the land. So such is the importance of the law of the land, that if you obey the law of the land, we are actually following our own religion. It's something which our religion tells us. And every upright religion tells its followers that they must not cause anarchy and disorder in the country that they are living in. So now let's move on to the next part of our discourse or session. And this relates to the hadith of the day. And the hadith that I have selected here is being displayed before you. It is selected from the Al-Jami al-Sahih of Imam Muslim. And let me read out the text and translation of the verse. It says, عن أبي هريرة أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال ليس الشديد بالسرعة إنما الشديد الذي يملك نفسه عند الغضب. So Abu Huraira reported that God's messenger said, a strong person is not the one who wrestles well, but the one who controls himself in anger. So this is of utmost importance, and you can see that the stress which religion lays on us is that we have to exercise self-control. And when we lose self-control, this is where we know that extremes result. And there is no more an extreme than the extreme called anger, which when arises in us, it can really cause a lot of bother, a lot of problems for us. Hence, it is essential that we control our anger. we need to realize that anger in itself is not a condemnable thing. It is not something in its of a negative emotion in itself, because if we feel angry at the injustices suffered by people, or if we feel angry when a child gets raped or a girl gets raped, it's all the more important that we that anger has to arise in us, but there is a way to express that anger. So anger in itself is not a negative emotion. It in its own place, it's something which is required. But again, even after that requirement, there is a method to the expression of our anger. Now, anger is something which is faced by each one of us in some time, at some time or the other. And our younger generation, it grows up, and we have all passed through this age. We know that in the adolescent age, anger management needs a lot of work to be done. We have to control our anger. We have to advise our younger generation how to control anger. And let me give you some tips in this regard, which might be helpful. So I would divide these tips into two parts. One can be called the short-term tips, and the other can be called the long-term tips. So as far as the short-term tips are concerned, they basically relate to delaying our reaction. The more we are able to delay our reaction, the better we will be in responding to a situation, and the better we'll be in controlling our anger. Now, as far as delaying our reaction is concerned, again, this is something which can be done through small gestures, through small acts, like for example, changing our posture. If we are standing, we should sit down. If we are sitting, we can stand up. Changing our location. So we just leave the place where the whole incident had occurred in which we got angry. Similarly, drawing large breaths like this and suggesting to ourselves sentences like calm down, cool down. So all these have a delayed effect. They actually delay our reaction. And then, of course, if these are still not working, then there is this method called physical release, in which you can go to a room, pick up a bat or anything, and just start hitting a pillow or any surface in which that anger which is built up in you is actually released. You have this catharsis. So all of these are short-term measures in which the purpose is that you actually exchange, or you delay the reaction. You don't let that reaction get through you and get the better of you. So, as I was saying, that these actions, these delayed reactions, they have to be practiced well in advance, and you have to suggest to ourselves that once we get angry, some of the ways in which we can control our anger is these short-term measures in which we have to delay our immediate response. And the more we delay it, the better our response will become. The second thing, which is very important, and which would call our long-term measures, is that we have to actually keep this very important psychological, I would say, phenomena, which helps us a lot in a lot of other things, and it helps us in controlling our anger also, and that is self-suggestion. We have to suggest to ourselves that whenever the time of crisis comes, whenever the anger situation arises, I'm going to control myself. I'm not going to lose my control. I'm not going to lose my cool. So these suggestive sentences, when you state them or utter them to your own self in normal circumstances, when you're not angry, they imperceptibly have this effect on you. They cause this effect on you that when the time comes, when the crunch time comes, you recall those sentences, and you have that time in which you actually can control yourself much better. So one of these very effective long-term measures is this phenomenon called autosuggestion, in which you actually suggest to yourselves when you're not angry that whenever I get angry, I'm not going to behave in a manner which is not befitting for me. The second important thing, or second important long-term measure in this regard, is that we have to be relaxed individuals in our lives, because you see what happens is that our threshold comes very easily. We get angered very easily, and this is because we are at the verge of getting angry every now and then. So if we are relaxed individuals, like for example, we take life easily, we take life in a very comfortable and a positive way, the threshold which will be required for us to reach that anger situation will increase, and it will give you more time and a bigger buffer. And as I said, the best thing for that would be, one of the best things I would say is a physical workout. So things that we enjoy the most, and this includes physical workout, this includes many other things, they tend to relax us. So if we are relaxed individuals in our normal lives, in times of anger, that threshold of anger will come much late, and we'll be able to control ourselves much easily. It is because that we are generally not relaxed individuals. Generally, we are prone to extremes. We are always agitated. It's like a permanent state of agitation that we are in. When we are in a permanent state of agitation, that means that our threshold is very small, and a little, very small prompt, a very small stimulant will then make us cross those limits. So this is very important. And the third thing is that we have to realize that one of the things which makes us impatient and angry is that we want favorable results. We want results to come in our according to our own expectations. And here we have to trust God. We have to trust God and see that there is a grand scheme of things according to which the Almighty is actually treating us and dealing with us. And not everything happens according to when that grand scheme of things comes into play. Not everything happens according to our own understanding, according to our own expectation. So we have to trust God and always think that when the Almighty is doing something which might not be favorable to our own selves, apparently, in the very first instance, there has to be something good hidden behind it. We have to trust God. And I am sure that whenever all of us look back, we do realize that there are so many instances in our life that whenever something happened and when we thought that that thing happened and it did not augur us well, we actually, when we look back, we thought that, okay, although at that particular time we thought that something bad is happening, but now that it has happened, we think that it was good because there was some good hidden, which at that instance was not revealed to us, not available to us. But now, retrospectively, when we look back in hindsight, we find that that thing had done something good for us. So these are some of the long-term measures which I've suggested. So basically, controlling anger is something in which these short-term measures as well as these long-term measures have to be employed at the same time. And finally, let me also point out, my dear participants, that if in spite of all these measures we fail to control our anger, then we must immediately go and apologize to the person with whom we spoke badly or harshly or did something bad. Because this is something, if in spite of our control we could not do so, then the other best thing that we can do is go and make amends, say sorry to that person, and if he did something bad, we actually offer compensation for that. So this has to happen every time. Whatever evil we commit, whatever vice we commit, it's not just with anger. Any bad thing that we commit with another person, any wrong act that we commit with the other person has to be compensated, has to be apologized. And when we start doing this, this act of apology in itself is actually a self-correcting process, and it's a self-correcting mechanism. And the more we apologize to the other person, the more it will become easier for us in future not to behave in a rash way. Right now, let's move on to the third part of our segment here. This is the first session, and this is a verse from the Bible. And the verse that I've selected from the Bible is a very famous verse. In fact, these are two verses taken from the Gospel of Saint Matthew, and you can just read through and feel the vibrance, the sort of feeling that you get when you read these verses. And they are, and Jesus said to him, have love for the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest rule. So Jesus is teaching this to his disciples, that you have to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, which in fact actually encompasses your intellect and your own emotions. You see, all of us are actually, uh, all of us are either emotionally charged or we are intellectually bent. So both these proclivities exist. People are either more intellectual and less emotional, or they are more emotional and less intellectual, or there's a third category in which they are intellectual and emotional at the same time, and they are balanced individuals. So what Jesus is actually pointing out here is that you have to love God not only through your mind, which is the center of your intellect, but also through your heart and soul. Your mind and soul is your center of your intellect, and also through your heart, which is the center of your emotions. So it's like an all-encompassing statement that you have to love God. And when we say love God, I don't think that this expression needs any explanation. It's much like loving your own mother. I mean, it's that thing is something of a very small comparison, but just to get a feel of what love means, it means that unconditional love. And when you start loving your mother the way you should actually love her and look at what she's done for you, look at the sacrifices that she's made for you, and you can similarly see that the love of God has to be million times more because the things that he has provided, in fact, it is he who has provided us with these things called mothers, which are, of course, one of the most beautiful creatures of this earth and the most selfless of creatures of this earth. So it's like a gushing fountain which comes out. It's like a spontaneous reaction that comes out of you when you love your mother. You don't need any reasoning to love your mother. You don't need anyone to tell you that you have to love your mother. So our love of God has to be on very similar lines. We don't need anyone to tell us that you have to love God because this is something which comes out of us in a very natural way, like a fountain gushing out of ourselves. This love has to know the fact that loving God is actually it actually means that you have to please God, you have to make him happy because it's like someone who has provided for you, someone who has cared for you, someone who has actually supported you in all your problems and your difficulties, someone who has helped you, someone who has accepted your duas and your prayers, and someone who is the biggest support. All of us need friends. All of us need friends. And I'm sure that you would agree with me that even with the best of friends, we are not able to share a lot of things. The closest of our friends are not, we are not actually not feel comfortable to share many of our inner secrets and our inner thoughts, our inner emotions, but we can trust God because He knows how we feel. He knows our inner self. He is the biggest support that we have, and all other supports are temporary. The only support which is permanent is God. So, although we can make friends and we should make friends because friends have their own place, but let us make God as our biggest friend, as our greatest friend, because He is one friend who's going to be there for us all our lives. We can fall back on Him, we can speak to Him, we can talk to Him, we can trust Him, we can share everything with Him, we can argue with Him, we can do all sorts of conversations with him. And there is nothing more reassuring, nothing more comforting than this strong relationship with the Almighty. It is the basis of all your religion. It is the basis of all our actions. In fact, it is this basis which actually tells us that it is going to be a hereafter in which the Almighty is going to question us, because if in this world He has given us a lot of favors, a lot of gifts, then this cannot be without a purpose. And hence, this love of God actually leads us to this notion of accountability, to this notion of the fact that we have to be answerable to God for whatever He has given us. So, viewers, this brings us to the end of our first session of this study circle, in which we have discussed some Quranic verses, a Hadith of the Prophet, and a Bible and two Bible verses from the Gospel of Saint Matthew. And before we move on to the next segment, let me know if you have any questions regarding this part.
I have a question from Yasin Fahad Saiba. Please unmute your mic.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum.
जी भाई.
I have a question that's kind of related to the anger problem. Sometimes we have a closed ones, close relatives who really care and love us a lot. We know they really care, but then they tag it with expectations, right? And when those don't happen, they are mostly upset or angry with you or with everyone. And it's really hard to explain it to them that their love or caring is becoming a burden instead of a pleasure. So how should we deal with such a situation or such a person? How should we approach it?
Well, that's something which does happen very commonly. And I would suggest that the first thing that needs to be understood and maybe made a very important guideline is that we have to be patient. You see, when we find out that people are not behaving the way that they should behave with us, this in itself is a form of trial. This in itself is a form of test. And when we say that life is a test, and when we say that life is a trial, then what else does it mean than this? That we are tested, we are tried by other people, by the attitudes of other people, by the circumstances that we are in. And one of these trials and one of these tests is how other people behave with us. They don't behave in the optimum way. They don't behave in the way they should behave. And the example of the situation that you have pointed out is again one of those situations in which we are actually facing a trial or a test. And this trial and a test has to be taken up as a challenge. Instead of getting frustrated or disappointed, we have to find ways and means to deal with the challenge. We just cannot run away from our relatives. We cannot forsake them. If they are close ones or near ones, we have to deal with them. We have to learn to deal with them and take it as a challenge and take it as a test which the Almighty has actually made us go through so that we can earn more reward. And this varies, I would say, from case to case. There are several tips which can be given, but the bottom line is patience, steadfastness, have a smiling face. Let not the other person think that you are angry with him or her, or you're frustrated. Always have a very, very pleasant countenance, a very pleasant disposition, a very smiling face. This in itself has a calming effect on the other. And always realize that if you are bearing the other person's behavior, we ourselves are not perfect. There may be instances in which he or she is also bearing our bad behavior without us realizing it. So it's like a reciprocal thing. So by looking at our own faults and by showing patience and steadfastness and putting up this smiling face, I know these are difficult things, but then, as I said, this is the whole challenge of life. This is a test that we have made to pass through, and we have to think of ways and means in actually passing through this challenge in a very, very befitting way.
Thank you.
If I can ask a question, please.
Right.
It's my understanding that most of your advice does it relate to anger out of frustration? Because I believe a lot of times anger results. It has to do something with our ego as well. Is this advice applicable to those situations as well, or that has to be looked at and analyzed and dealt with differently?
That is equally applicable. And you see, one of the things which makes us angry is this ego which gets hurt. You see, people can have a large ego, they have a big ego, they have an ego which gets hurt. So that again is something which needs to be analyzed. That why is that happening? You see, when you have a hurt ego, why we have to analyze it. Why do we get that hurt ego? Why do we hurt our ego? Why do we find that it is that wounded ego or that wounded pride in us? The reason for that is that we don't expect results according to we don't actually find results which are against our expectations to be congenial to us. It hurts our ego, and we have to realize that there is a grand scheme of things in which if results are coming out in a different way, and as a result our ego is getting hurt because of that, we need to realize that we have to find out that there is a way from the Almighty. He is giving us a signal that if things are not happening our way, they're actually happening His way. And there has to be some good hidden or concealed, which we might not at that time decipher or detect. So the bottom line is that yes, it relates to that this situation. Ego is something which we have to control, and the best way to control our ego basically is to realize that we have to trust God. And if something is happening which is against our ego, it's happening because God has actually ordained it. We have tried our best, but things have not happened the way we would have expected them to happen. So there has to be a grand scheme of things that we need to trust and find out that if that grand scheme of things is working against our own scheme, then I have to wait and see the good that is hidden. And as I've already pointed out, that there have been several instances in our life. If we look back, we realize that if something had happened which we were expecting to happen, it did not happen, and we got angry. Later on, we realized that thank God it did not happen, because if it had happened, such and such things would have resulted, which would be very wrong for us. So it's like introspecting, looking back, and also finding out that if our ego is getting hurt, This is because we think that we are the main planners. We are the people whose execution should be followed. But we have to realize that there is a greater planner than us, and is God. And if we submit to God and to His plan, we will have the ego problem that we have will inshallah will be overcome.
Thank you very much. We have no more questions, so you can proceed.
Okay.
So the misconception or the issue that I would like to raise and discuss in the next session relates to a very important social issue, which actually you can find very rampant in most Western countries where Muslims live as minorities. This might not be very common in Muslim countries like Pakistan or India, or predominantly areas which have a large minority, like, for example, as I said, India has almost the same population, if not more, of Muslims. Similarly, Malaysia or Indonesia or Sudan or Turkey, Muslim dominant countries. But slowly and surely, the issue that I'm going to discuss is also getting perceptible in these areas, and hence it needs some addressing, some guideline, some discussion at how should we deal with this. And that is the presence or the ever-growing presence of the LGBT community in the whole world, and how should our younger generation, or how as we individuals living in that environment and hence coming across them as our colleagues, as our friends, as our classmates, as our neighbors, or as any other person is concerned. So how should we deal with such people? So this question has become important, or assumed a lot of importance, because as you would see, most of the parents who face this question, they end up either scolding their children or trying or telling them off that they must not make friends with such people, they must not bring them home, they must not go and visit them, they in fact should stay away from such people, and hence live in isolation. And of course, this becomes a huge pressure, a huge peer pressure on the younger mind, because he or she is not able to appreciate that how is it possible to be in a class, to be in a group, to be in a group activity, because we know that classrooms have group activities, they have collective assignments, and there's many other things in which this interaction is inevitable. You just cannot avoid it. You just cannot stay away from it. In fact, if you do so, it becomes disrespectful to that person. So the first thing that I would suggest and advise is that we have to realize that if there is something that we regard to be a sin or a bad thing, then staying away from such people is not advisable at all. As I repeatedly say, that you can be averse to the sin but not to the sinner. You just cannot run away, or you just cannot evade people in a society that you live in. You have your own point of view. You have your own view of life. Other people have their view of life. You need to respect other people's orientation. You need to respect other people's view of life. This is because when you live in a society, you live with this basic value called freedom, liberty, to choose the path that you think is right, and let the Almighty decide if a person is doing something wrong, or if he needs to be punished, or if he needs to be looked after. This is something between him or her and God Himself. It's not for us to decide. As for our own selves, we have several blemishes that we must be actually more attentive to. We cheat, we lie, we don't speak the truth, we are unjust, we at times are rash, we lose our temper, we misbehave with our parents. So there are 101 other things that we people might have other forms of blemishes. So running away from the LGBT community or regarding them to be people who are eternal sinners, or someone who have to be hated, this is an absolutely wrong notion and a wrong idea, and a very unhealthy attitude. You can have your own opinion about a particular thing, but you cannot hate people for that, because when people adopt a certain way of life, the Almighty has given them the choice. Had the Almighty not given them the choice, He would have, of course, made people do the same thing as all of us are doing. He would have compelled us to do what is good, because it is the Almighty Himself who has given people the choice to do what they want, and then it is He who is going to take their account. It's not us who's going to be answerable for them. So we have to first of all realize that running away from these people or not making friends with them is just not on. You behave with this community the way you would behave with other people. Of course, there is a subtle different distance that you can maintain, but willfully advising your children that you must not bring them home or you must not meet them, this is, I would not recommend this attitude at all. On the other hand, the attitude which I would recommend is that it's like saying that we love everyone and hate none. And if we have to hate something, we hate the sin and not the sinner. And this can only happen if we make friends with those people, if we behave normally, and if someone is doing wrong, we are not participating in that wrong that we ourselves consider to be wrong. Because when a person is doing something, he is not necessarily doing that because he thinks that he's doing the right thing. At times, people do; they have their own choices. So imposing our own choice to the on the other community is not at all advisable. We do what we think is right. Let other people do what other people think is right. Behave in a mutually congenial manner, with a reasonable distance. We can make friends. We can, of course, have a normal conversation. And of course, such issues don't come up in discussion, and you don't need to raise these questions. But if ever they are raised, one can express one's own opinion that this is something which we disagree very strongly, but we give the other person the right to behave and act, because this is a God-given right. We are no one to stop them. We can express our opinion in a very friendly way if we are asked, but we are no one to tell them off or to think that we are superior to them. One of the things which takes us away from people is this feeling of superiority that we might have as a result of not doing something that we think is wrong, which the other person is committing and which we are not. The proper attitude in this regard is to concentrate on our own evils and misdoings. We have to go through this process of self-accountability, which I often uh, try to raise in these sessions, that instead of looking how other people are or how the other people would fare before the eyes of God, instead of judging people through these things, if ever we have to judge, we should judge our own selves, because in our case, we do have the data, but in the case of other people, we do not have the data. We do not know what problem the other person might be going through and what excuse he might have and how the Almighty might actually look down upon him or look at upon him with favor or with other emotions. So the bottom line is that in a country in which this community exists, it has to be taken as a community. It has to be taken as a denomination in a society which has its own freedom of choice. It has its own right to select a way of life. We might not agree with it. When we are asked, we will express the fact that we disagree with this attitude, but at the same time, we give the other person the choice and the right to do whatever he or she would like to, because we are no ones to stop anyone or make any judgment. God has given each person the choice and the liberty to choose his path. And if he's going to do something wrong, it is the Almighty is who's going to take his account, or he is going to be answerable to him, not to us. As far as we are concerned, instead of looking at other people and thinking of their sins, it's much more worthwhile to look at our own sins. It's much more important to critically evaluate our own lives and to go through this process of self-accountability, which actually revolves around our own self-evaluation. It focuses on the fact that we have to become good individuals. We have to become upright individuals. We cannot decide the fate of other people. Every person has a right to his own view or her own view. We have a right to our own view. The other person has a right to own view. We do not have the right to judge people. We cannot be judgmental. We cannot have these sweeping statements that we give. This is the prerogative of the Almighty only, and therefore we must stop behaving as God. We must stop behaving as prophets. We are ordinary human beings, and as ordinary human beings, we have our own problems and our own blemishes to look after. And dealing with this community, which is ever growing, is I know it's a big challenge. It's easier said than done. But if we think, the only thing which I would point out here as my last point would be that if at all that we think that we ourselves might be drawn into this sin that we would not like to, of course, get into, only then is this advisable that we keep this more distance with this community. Otherwise, with a reasonable distance, If we can maintain cordial relations, this is actually what is required. And I must remind all of, including myself, all of you, that remember what Jesus had said in the Bible when he said that I have come not to the righteous, but to the sinners. So if we also think that if all of us, if we think that we have friends amongst us who have fallen into bad habits, then let us not run away from them. Let us stay close to them, because we might influence them into good. We might influence them into goodness and into habits that we think are good, and at the same time realize that if the other person is doing something which we think is wrong, we ourselves might be doing several things as wrong, and it's much more advisable to concentrate more on our own faults than to point out and dwell upon the faults of others. So this brings us to an end to this session, and I know it's something of a very sore nature, a very touchy topic, but I'd be glad to discuss ways and means or further input that you might give vis-a-vis this interaction. But as far as I'm concerned, this is how I feel, and I'd like you to let me know if you think that anything needs more discussion in this regard.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Dr. Saab, are you differentiating between forming close friendships versus having cordial relationship? Or no?
Right. So, so you're asking that we make this difference?
Are you different? You said that we have to keep relationships normal with these people in our school or other places, but are you saying should there be a discretion between forming close friendships versus not good?
I always go along with the famous German playwright and poet Goethe. So Goethe has very beautifully expressed this relationship between friends, and he says that we just don't know how this bond of friendship comes into being. And there's a book which I would advise all of you to read if you can have the time. It's called Elective Affinities, and Elective Affinities is a book which actually tells us that there are 100 different reasons which make us soulmates, which make us close together, and it's very difficult to just pinpoint what the reason is which has brought us together. So even in the case of this community, let this be a natural thing. If cordial relations are something which have to be there for every single individual, regardless, as far as more than that is concerned, for example, having close friendship ties, this I said is something which arises from those elective affinities about which we don't know. So I would say the bottom line is that good cordial relations have to be maintained with any community. But above that, if there is going to be something more than that, then that has to be left to the individual. Because you see, you just cannot say that you just cannot become a close friend with the person who is of this community, because that closeness or that, I would say, reason which makes us close is something which actually does not spring forth in a way in which we can analyze. It's, as I said, Goethe's rule of elective affinities. We just don't know how people become close to each other. So let it be a natural phenomena in which if you make friends with a person of that community, it should happen naturally. We should not stop us from becoming friends, because you see, generally people become friends when they have common habits, when they have common views, when they have common things. And at times it is the opposite as well. There are certain things common and certain things which are not common. So let this happen naturally. And if it happens that you become a close friend to a person of that community, even in those circumstances, being at guard, of course, that is something that we must maintain. But simply because he or she is a person of the opposite community, we cannot become close to him or her. I would not recommend that. I would leave it to that personal inclination and friendship, which if it develops, it should develop. And you should be strong enough to hold on to your values and influence the other person as far as you can. And if you think that is something that you might succumb to, then again, it is something of your own decision that you make.
Dr. Saab, I was asking this from a parent's perspective. You see, in high school or that age, it's a very impressionable age, and company matters. The company affects, a company influences a child. So I was asking from that perspective, if I need to advise child, or in that situation also leave it to the normal development of things.
You see,
As I said, if your child has been given attention to, if you have developed those basic values, of course, one of the very basic values which is found, which is actually innately found in all of us, and which as parents we can make more sensitive, create more sensitivity about it, is this value of chastity or modesty or haya, or this concept that we are individuals who have a certain orientation, and how this orientation relates to our own moral being, to our own religious being. So this is already there. If you have reared your child, groomed your child with that sensitivity, with that inclination, then all you need to tell them is how important family life is, how important the Almighty stresses that relationships have to be in a normal way. So if that upbringing has been done in a proper way since childhood, in this particular forming period, all you need to do is just to let them know, and then let them make the choice, let them make the final decision, because we don't know. I can assure you, because I know a lot of children of this age who feel a lot of pressure from their parents when they advise them that they have to stay away from this community. They don't realize that it's like telling a fish to remain out of water and still be alive. It's virtually impossible. So you need to realize that when you give an advice to a child, you have to give it in the circumstances that you find them in, and the circumstances that they now find themselves in is very much like being fish in water. So it's not, you just cannot live outside that water. You cannot survive. So you have to tell them that you have to be in that water, in that area. However, these are some of the things that might help you in being there. So it's like saying that you live in that community, you just cannot come out of that community, but there are certain values that we adhere to. Of course, the other person has his own or her own values, and those values need to be strengthened in our children. But stopping them is not the solution, which, as I said, can only be done if something is of a very small nature. When something proliferates in the society, when it starts to become a value in the society, it starts to become an understanding in the society. In fact, it becomes a stigma if you do something opposite to it. Then the proper way is to create this awareness in your child as to what right and wrong is, and let him or her judge for her own self that what is the extent to which this happens. I know this is a big challenge because, as you said, rightly said, that this is an impressionable age. And in that impressionable age, you catch a lot of things. If you're a weak person, you succumb to them, you're led into them. But it is here that the parent needs to realize that this is a human weakness that we have all gone through in our lives, that we're still going through in our lives. And the best thing that we can do is make them more aware of what right and wrong are, and tell them that if this is something which they might indulge into, it can go to huge extremes. So we need to educate them. We need to tell them to be on their guard, and also let them decide for their own selves, and not force them or not stop them from doing certain things. Because, as I said, the amount of pressure that it creates on a young mind is huge. They have enough pressure as regard their studies are concerned, and we are adding that pressure when we are telling them that we should stay away from such people. As I said, it's this discussion that we need to do with our children is to inculcate the values and the approach that we have in life. And then if they come across, let them come up with a question which you answer. Instead of you taking the initiative, your initiative should be in a broad sense, in a general instructional sense. But if there has to be a particular area, it should be they coming to you and perhaps asking, how should we do it? If you put them to the sword, or put them to a very, very harsh discipline, I dare say that this would be counterproductive. I know it's a very difficult thing. I know it's a huge and a big challenge, but the answer to this challenge is not to tell them off, or not to make them hate such people, or not to make them stay away, or even stop them from becoming friends. But the answer lies in making them more strengthening them in their own values, and making them realize how important those values are for them.
I think you explained it very good way. I understand your point that, in some ways, from a parent's concerned perspective, we have a responsibility as parents as well. And it starts long before that impressionable age and that time. We have to do our work first, and that's the way to approach it instead of just forcing them to. Thank you very much. Yasin Fahad, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dr. Shehzad. It's a very important and controversial matter here. We work with this community. We have them as office colleagues. Our kids have them as friends. I personally went through it. My daughter was in high school and she had a friend from that community, and we discussed it. And I told her, I said, it's fine to be friends, but you have to know that this is not something that's acceptable to us. It's against our religious norms, and that's not the way God has given us. But it's okay. You don't have to discuss it with them. You don't have to tell them what's right or wrong at this point, but you should be clear in your mind that this is not something that's right. So at that point, I approached it like that. And even now, I tell my kids the same thing. However, there is a new challenge that has come up here, and they are teaching in schools now that some people by nature God have made them that way, that like they could be boys in body but they are more inclined to be girls, and it could be the vice versa as well. So now my kids were asking me, well, mom, it's not their fault if God made them like that. So I explained to them, I said, well, no, that's not true. God does not make people like that, but it's we humans. We have our own desires and stuff that make us like that. So we
Right.
still have to understand. But it is getting more challenging because they are teaching it that way now in schools. And
I
there have been
understand.
cases where kids have been confused because then they start thinking, oh, maybe I am like that too, you know? Like they start doubting themselves. So that is where I find now it's getting a bit challenging. So any advice with respect to that will be helpful.
Yes, as I said, you see, we have to present our values, our value system, and that should begin at a very early age. You see, what happens is that when a child gets out of our hands or when he does something that we might not like him or her to do, it is only then that we start to realize that something is happening. It should be well before that. I mean, when he is growing up, like a 5 or 6 year old or a 7 year old, it's that is the time in which you have to slowly, imperceptibly educate him or her so that by the time she passes through that adolescent age or he passes through that age, the basics have already been within him or within her. So what I find often happening with our parents is that they realize when the time is too late, when things have already happened, when things start to get out of control. So my advice is that start very early, teaching this value system, teaching your morality, teaching your norms. They have to begin at a very early age. And you see, these basic norms are already found in ourselves as human beings. Goodness and this path towards nature, this closeness towards nature, is already found in us. It is only that we need to make our children more sensitive. So my basic advice would be that please start off early. And also let me point out to another aspect which I'd like to now raise that now that you've asked this question, and that is another area which is even more challenging and even more difficult, and that is what if your own child opts to become one of the members of that community. So this is one thing, that he or she remains the way she or he is and then interacts with them. And this is an even more challenging thing for us, that if one of our children decides to become one of those, so what is then to be done? So here my advice would be that, as I said, if in spite of all our values teaching that we did in our earlier days, that we were able to tell them, if finally he or she has made this choice, we still should not we have no right to actually forcibly stop them. That's a given. But even in this situation, we must not hate them. We must not. I've seen parents telling or threatening their child that you just leave this house, don't come to this house, don't sleep here, and you're just like no one to me. No, that's not the right way in any case. Whatever your child is, whatever mistake he commits, this is, if this is one of the mistakes that we think that he has done, again, dealing with such a child or with such a mistake needs a lot of technique. And I would say it's a skill. Child parenting itself is a skill, as you would all know. Parenting is something which needs to be actually learned. And one of the rules of parenting is that when your child is a grown-up child, he or she has his own personality, then, as I said, you cannot impose your personality on him or her. she has now or he has now developed into a full grown human being. And if he is or she has chosen to be an LGBT, much to your own dislike, then he or she has been given this freedom by the Almighty. We are no one to stop him. We can advise him or her. We can tell her or him of the bad consequences. All the suggestions that we have, we can come up with them. But it's not advisable at all that we start hating them or turning them out of our houses or uh, dealing with them as if they are untouchables. No, that's not the way. Because remember, as I said, each individual, once he or she grows up, he or she has the right to accept, to chalk out his own frame of life, to chalk out his own opinion. If he chooses to become a person of that community, well, we can do nothing except in our own good faith and in our own good friendship with him or her, try to tell him or her how this would affect him or her. But that's it. We still have to remain friends and still respect that he has been given this choice. It's like being given this human right by the Almighty. We are no ones to forcibly stop him. Of course, we can advise and do all the other things that we can, but forcibly stopping him or her, or getting angry at him or her, or threatening him or her with dire circumstances or dire consequences is not the answer or is not the solution to this problem. The solution is to getting close, to still having that bond of trust between one another. And then, even if that does not help him or her in for example, accepting the same worldview as yours, then accepting that this is something which he or she has been given the right by the Almighty. He and she has been given the right to choose a path for himself or herself, because of he or she is going to be answerable for that path to the Almighty, not us. And therefore, this is a bigger challenge that if our children take up this lifestyle. But again, the only answer to this challenge is this friendship, is to increase our love for them. And if they insist that they would like to do what they are doing, then we have to accept that this is how they have made this choice, and we have to respect this choice. I
Yeah,
know it's
but Dr.
difficult.
Shehzad, I know it's difficult, and I totally agree with you. What you're saying is correct. We do start it at an early stage. Like I have tried to teach my kids because it's a common thing here. Even a 7-year-old knows what that is. So we do discuss these topics. But I guess now it's getting harder because I'm telling them something that's our value and trying to instill into them. But over here, they've started from kindergarten trying to teach the kids it's okay to have two dads or it's okay to have two moms. And
Right.
then, so it's kind of like knowledge being taught at home versus knowledge being taught at a school. So kids are kind of confused, they are like, we are trying to do our best and, we hope that God will guide them. But I think because now it is at a younger age, they are teaching it in the schools in a different perspective. It is getting much harder to make them understand. So,
Yeah, I do.
is there anything specifically in Quran that we can show them or teach them? How, like I know, Prophet Lut's nation was like that, but apart from that, anything else we can show them, that would clearly tell them, okay, this is very disliked by God. It's not something that, that's. I just wanted to know if there is any.
Well,
The most important thing that you can educate your child is regarding the institution of the family and the fact that a mother and a father both are needed in the natural way to bring them up. You see, single parent families or same gender families, they actually have some void in them. And you have to educate them that the scheme of God is that a mother and a father, a biological mother and a father, both are required for the upkeep and grooming of the child, and how the institution of family is protected through them, and how a child needs the love of the mother and the love of the father at the same time. And if he has either of them, then there is something which gets missing in his personality. The scheme of God is that they need both these individuals in their life. So it's like actually telling them the importance of the system of the family and the role which a father and a mother play, and how when we start indulging in these activities, do we actually jeopardize the family system, and we actually don't realize that the child who's going to be there, or maybe not, maybe in a different way, he or she is going to be reared in a way in which there's going to be something missing. And of course, this is something which we would be depriving him of or her of. So I would say that it's like telling him or her or educating him or her on the importance of the system of the family and how actually it is the basic building block of the society that we live in. And on this institution depends the basic upkeep and the upgrowth of a family in a society. If a society at the family level is going to be a family or a society in which these values are upheld at the family level, only then are these values going to be upheld at the societal level. So because it's the basic building block, so the building block has to be of the correct nature. If there is any corruption in that building block, it's going to infiltrate in the whole society.
Thank you, Dr. Saab.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, our time is up. Dr. Saab, with your permission, if we can extend it 5 minutes, the reason is Rafia Khaja Saiba had sent me 3 questions in an email. She wasn't able to join today, but I see she's just joined the class. If we can extend it 5 minutes, maybe she can ask one questions, whatever that time allows. And Rafia Saiba, if you can, whatever remains, if we can take it up in the next class, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Go ahead and unmute your mic, please.
Dr. Shehzad, my question is, one is the translation of the ayat in which Allah says that we can create you, we will create you in the forms that you don't even know. So I don't understand, does it regard physical form or is it pertaining to something else?
Well, I'll have to look up that verse actually, because you see there are contexts to each of the verses.
It's Surah 56, ayat 61, I think.
So so what I'll do is I'll look up the verse and then I'll email you my answer.
Okay.
So I will go through the verse and the context.
The second question, Dr. Shehzad, is regarding the theme talaqs. We are having a big argument here in the family, and one family member says that saying 3 talaq is totally all right. And I've heard Ghamdi Saab, and I understand that you can't say 3 talaqs and it becomes effective. So if you could tell me regarding this.
Well, there is so much material that we have written and lectured on this particular topic, because it's a sore topic and it's a very misunderstood topic as well. So I would request you that if you could read some of our things which we have written, you can find them on our website, and some of the lectures on this topic, because it's slightly of a detailed nature in which the whole concept of talaq needs to be discussed. Or maybe what I can do is in the next session, I can actually in the misconception segment, the second segment, what we can do is we can take up this issue of talaq and have a detailed discussion on that. So I think perhaps that would be better if we take it up as a misconception and then discuss it in the next class.
And you would and you would be able to quote some ayat, because here everything is that okay, quote the Quran.
Right.
And my last question is that non-Muslims like Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, many of them follow their religion very diligently, but yet before they die they haven't had a chance to study Islam, and they die. So how is Allah going to judge them?
Well, first of all, we should perhaps try to concentrate more on how God is going to judge us. We have often this question that how is Allah going to judge Jews and Christians and non-believers and Hindus? So the first thing I would say is that we should try to scrape off this question when it comes to our mind, because generally this is something which leads us to judging other people without having enough data. But that is a principal statement. Other than that, what the Almighty has said to us is that we are going to be held accountable according to what we have understood in this life, and we are going to be held accountable for that in the hereafter. So hence, if they have not believed in the final prophet, for example, or some truth has not come before them, an analysis will be made, I would assume, by the Almighty in the hereafter as to whether the news of a new prophet did not reach them, or perhaps if it reached them, it was in a distorted form, or perhaps the misdeeds of Muslim reached them prior to what the call of the messenger was. So there could be a number of things going on. I have just named 2 or 3 of them. The variables are several. So whether the call of the new prophet was a confusion to them, or a misperception, or a misunderstanding, or an absolute lack of information for them, and there could be other scenarios as well, is something which we can only know in the time when the judgment takes place. But the thing that we can say is that if they were convinced of the veracity of a new prophet, they were convinced, and they still denied out of arrogance or any other reason, then that will be a cause of great concern for them, and this might actually lead them to a very bad fate. But unless this deliberate denial after being convinced of a reality is there, there are several other scenarios which can be imagined and which could actually lead them to paradise. And so therefore I would say that unless this is the case, that a person has intentionally denied the truth, like for example a prophet of God, and in spite of being convinced of his veracity, that is the only benchmark that we have. Other than that, there could be several scenarios in which a benefit of the doubt could be given to them.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. I look forward to next week to be able to being able to discuss the talaq, and I'll send you the surah and ayat, and maybe you can just explain it to me.
Rafi Sahaba, I have already forwarded your email to Shehzad Sahab, so he has it.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to both of you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shehzad Sahab. Inshallah, we'll meet next Saturday.
Inshallah.
Okay, ji. Khuda Hafiz. Thank you.